Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Alchemist. Tonight, we spin a tale of fire, fate, and a queen who refused to go quietly into old age. We're standing at the edge of a velvet-draped bedchamber, where candles burn low and court physicians whisper in Latin, while trying not to look afraid. Outside, storm clouds knot over stone turrets, and inside, a queen whose breath grows shallower by the hour, fixes her eyes on something no one else can see. You probably want to know this. In medieval times, royalty didn't just worry about armies and assassins. They feared something much more unstoppable: time. Wrinkles were political liabilities. Youth meant command. So, when all else failed, they turned to alchemists, the half-scientists, half-sorcerers who brewed dreams in lead and mercury. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Queen of Aravel was dying. Not dramatically, not even inconveniently. She was simply running out of years like ink from a quill. Her doctors said natural causes with grave nods. The priest said prayers and asked politely for her jewelry to be willed to the cathedral. But Queen Meravine, she had other plans. In her youth, Meravine had been the kind of queen people carved into stained glass, sharp jaw, sharper words, and a smile that could cut silk. But lately, mirrors betrayed her. Her bones ached. Her dreams, once filled with strategy and swordplay, were now filled with quiet fires and missing teeth. Which is why, on a midnight soaked in rain and secrecy, she summoned her court alchemist. He arrived in smoke, or at least it seemed that way. Alaric the Verdant so-called, not for his fashion sense, which leaned dangerously into mildew, but for his obsession with green vitriol and the transformation of base matter, was not a man who enjoyed sunlight. He had lived in the castle's north tower for 27 years, growing increasingly strange with each royal grant. "Your Grace," he said, bowing with a clinking pouch of glass vials at his hip. Meravine did not look up. "Alaric, make me young again," most would have flinched. Instead, Alaric sighed softly through his beard. "You do know what you're asking, my queen. I'm asking not to die, wheezing into crushed linen," she replied. "Do you have something or not?" Now, here's a real fact most history books gloss over. Some medieval alchemists weren't charlatans. They were proto-chemists with a dangerous degree of curiosity and access to rare materials: antimony, arsenic, mandrake, and powdered pearl. One even accidentally isolated phosphorus while trying to extract gold from human urine. He failed, but his socks glowed for days. Alaric reached into his pouch and pulled forth a black box carved with sigils so old they looked like melted bone. From it he drew 3 vials. "The elixir of strength," he said, lifting the first thick and gold like molten armor. "The elixir of sleep," he added, showing a second vial that shimmered pale blue and moved like fog, and the elixir of fire. The third vial was dark, barely glowing. Inside, red flecks danced in black fluid, as if embers floated in pitch. "What does it do?" she asked. He hesitated. "It burns what no fire can reach. Dreams. Doubt. Time, perhaps. Has it been tested?" "No," he said honestly. "But it was written of in the Book of Ash. Before it was burned, of course. Historians still argue whether the so-called Book of Ash ever existed. Some say it was a Sumerian grimoire, transcribed by desert monks in the 3rd century. Others believe it was an alchemical metaphor for the final destruction of the self. One thing's for sure, no 2 scholars agree on what it contained. Queen Meravine stared at the 3 vials. Her hands trembled, but not from weakness. From want. The elixir of strength might keep her body from collapsing. The elixir of sleep might grant her peace and visions. But the elixir of fire, it sang to her. She chose the 3rd. Alaric did not protest. He simply handed her the vial with a gloved hand and stepped back. "Drink before you sleep," he said, "and lock your doors." She did. That night, Queen Meravine lay beneath velvet canopies and felt the liquid burn like crushed rubies down her throat. It wasn't painful, but it was sharp, electric. Her chest thrummed as if a tiny forge had been built behind her ribs. She closed her eyes, and she dreamed. At first it was nonsense. A fox made of cinders danced across a frozen lake. A child's laughter echoed from under the throne. Stars fell like ash. But then the fox looked at her and said, "Wake up." Her eyes flew open. Her bedroom was silent. But on the stone floor, fresh scorch marks curved in the same shape as the fox's paw prints. She sat up slowly, heart hammering. Then behind her, the fire in the hearth flared without wind. A whisper coiled out of the flame. "Drink again." She turned, but the vial was empty. Outside her window, a single rosebush in the palace gardens had caught fire. It did not burn to ash. It burned brighter. And far below the palace, in the dungeons where the oldest stones were laid, something shifted. Something that had not moved in 100 years. The fire didn't spread. That was the first oddity noted by the night guards who discovered the flaming rosebush. It burned. Yes. Petals glowing with orange and gold, leaves curling into living embers. But it never consumed itself. No smoke, no smell, just a flickering glow licking the dark like it belonged there. They called for the steward, who called for the high gardener, who grumbled about frostfire fungus until he actually saw it. He fell silent, then asked someone to fetch him a prayer rope. The queen, they decided, need not be disturbed. Of course, Queen Merivine was already watching. She stood barefoot in her chamber, in a robe of ivory fur and gold thread, staring out over the garden like a ghost fresh from the grave. Her hand clutched the window frame. Her pupils, once the dull grey of age, now shimmered faintly red. And below her, unseen, Elaric the Verdant sat cross-legged in his tower laboratory, 3 floors above the rest of the Seine. He hadn't slept. His fingers traced the edge of a scorched manuscript. The 3rd vial, he had only read of it in fragments. The flame that didn't warm, the fire that devoured the boundary between dream and waking. He scribbled a note in the margins. Subject consumed elixir at midnight. By second bell, rosebush combusted with no fuel. Implication, psychological energy externalized. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, I may have made a mistake. The next morning, Queen Merivine convened her inner court. She looked different. Still old, yes, but not dying. Her spine straight, her voice cold, clear, and commanding. She wore no crown, just a single ruby pinned in her hair, burning with the same slow pulse as her eyes. I dreamt, she said simply, and the dream obeyed. The courtiers exchanged glances. Lady Haverin blinked first. Your Majesty, forgive. What do you mean? The Queen turned her gaze on her. Haverin immediately regretted speaking. I dreamt a rose was lit from within, the Queen said, and now it burns. No one had an answer for that. Historical note here. It wasn't unusual for monarchs to claim divine visions. Kings and queens regularly insisted angels advised them. Saints whispered guidance, or ancient spirits walked through their gardens, offering tips on tax policy. But Merivine's claim felt sharper. Less divine revelation, more witch's prophecy. She stood. Summon the architect, she said. I will redraw my bedchamber. The dream wishes to walk further. No one moved, not until she added, now. That afternoon, workers tore down the wall facing the gardens. By royal decree, they replaced it with open archways. Curtains of red silk hung in place of stone. It was, objectively, mad. The castle's historian, a dry man named Ulbrand, who collected death warrants like trading cards, scribbled urgently in his private ledger, the Queen awakens with fire in her voice. She speaks not in riddles but in command. Has something entered her, or has something always waited? Historians still argue whether this marked the beginning of her second reign or her first possession. Ulbrand's ink smudged when a heat pulse rippled across the corridor. That night, 3 candles in the chapel exploded into small jets of flame. A tapestry depicting the sainted King Rowan blackened from the eyes outward. And in the west wing, a maid discovered the walls of her closet had begun to glow, like stone lit from within. She fainted on the spot. Back in the tower, Alaric prepared his defences. Not against the Queen, though he suspected she was becoming something that would soon need defending from. No, He feared what else might be following her dream trail. He boiled alum and blood iron, powdered jet, and suspended moon milk crystals over a cauldron. Every few minutes, he stopped and sniffed the air. In medieval lore, the scent of burning cinnamon and sulfur was said to indicate a spirit's passage. He smelled both. He was not comforted. Remember this fringe tidbit. In 1321, a French monastery recorded the sudden eruption of a bonfire inside their wine cellar. No wood, no spark. Witnesses claimed a monk had been praying too hard and lit his own wine aflame with thought. The monk later vanished. No one talks about it today, but the pattern's there. The queen began sleeping less and pacing more. At night, she roamed the palace barefoot, dragging her fingers across the walls. Wherever her skin touched, the stone warmed. Then came the morning of the dream parchment. She summoned her steward. "Bring me ink, and lambskin, and a brazier." He obliged, cautiously. She sat in her newly opened chamber, light from the eternal rose fire outside flickering over her hands, and began to draw, not maps, not edicts, but symbols. They looked ancient and alive. Alaric was summoned again. He studied the parchment with a furrowed brow. "These are dream letters." "Dreams don't write," said Lord Tellon, watching from the doorway. "Don't they?" the Queen replied. "What is a prophecy, if not a dream written in someone else's blood?" Tellon did not have an answer. Neither did Alaric. But he recognized one of the symbols. Barely. It belonged to the glyph of unrooting, a forgotten alchemical sigil theorized to unbind matter from time. In fringe alchemical circles, it was believed to let reality slip slightly, just enough for other possibilities to seep through. Alaric's hands trembled slightly. "You must stop dreaming," he told her. She turned. "Why?" "Because you are no longer dreaming inward. You are dreaming outward. And something may answer." The Queen only smiled. "Let it." That night, the curtains of her bed drifted like smoke, even though the air was still, and far away, beyond the eastern edge of the royal garden, a statue of an angel, stone since the days of her great-great-grandfather, turned its head half an inch. By morning, the grass around it was scorched. The Queen drank the fire elixir only once. That's what Alaric kept repeating to himself. Only once. The bottle was empty. The effect should have waned. Alchemical theory held that a single dose might produce a temporary transmutation, heat in the veins, heightened vitality, maybe even a lucid dream or two. But this was not temporary. By the third morning, the palace was holding its breath. Servants muttered prayers. Dogs refused to enter the eastern corridors, and the sunrise had begun arriving half an hour earlier over the Queen's chambers, as if time itself feared to disappoint her. Queen Merivine did not seem concerned. In fact, she seemed lighter, younger, not in the way her skin looked, the wrinkles remained, though fainter, but in how she moved. Her voice was silken flint again. Her laughter, rare though it was, now carried warmth and danger in equal measure, and she dreamed every night. Her ladies-in-waiting no longer slept in the same room. After the second evening, when all three were jolted awake by a low whispering from under the bed, the whispering of flames that hadn't yet ignited anything, they moved to adjacent quarters and refused to speak of it. Alaric tried again. "You cannot keep dreaming like this," he told her, pacing before the hearth that no longer needed logs. She reclined on a cushion of red velvet, sketching shapes in the air with a coal-black feather. "Can I not? You're bleeding the border. Dreams and reality are not supposed to touch." She looked up, half smiling. "Then why do they long for each other so much?" Let's pause for a historical reality check. In medieval philosophy, dreams weren't merely idle fancy. They were messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from the devil, and often from something even more ambiguous. Dream interpretation was a serious business. Entire manuscripts were written on it, and yet no manual ever addressed what to do if the dream walked into your waking world and rearranged your furniture. The fire elixir had changed something deep in Merivine, not just in her flesh, but in the weave of her being. She'd begun to write in her sleep, parchments filled with shifting runes and diagrams that rearranged themselves by morning. Courtiers whispered of them as living letters. Then came the second event. It began with a cough. Sadovian, the Queen's captain of the guard, was delivering the daily security report when he doubled over. not choking, just coughing into his gauntlet. When he pulled his hand away, glowing embers danced across his palm. He looked up in shock. The queen leaned forward. "What did you dream last night?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "I don't remember," she smiled faintly. "You do. Try." "I saw a forge," he said slowly. "In the sky, someone hammering stars." And even as he spoke, sparks lit the edge of his cloak. No fire, no pain, just gentle trails of light curling upward like smoke signals to an unseen dream god. Alaric, present for the scene, swore under his breath, loudly, "This is spreading." Miravine turned her gaze on him. "Isn't that what fire does?" And that night, she dreamed again. This time, she saw a garden made of glass. Each flower shimmered with heat. Butterflies flapped wings of gold leaf. In the center, a child stood with her face turned upward, fire dancing on her open palms. The queen recognized the child. It was her. When she woke, her windows had fogged from the inside. The scent of roses and charcoal drifted through the room. On her pillow, a single glass petal. She placed it in her jewelry box. Outside, gardeners discovered a new patch of roses had emerged overnight. But these weren't red or pink. They were black, shot through with veins of copper. When touched, they were warm. The roses weren't the only things waking up. Deep beneath the palace, in the vaults that predated even the current foundation, rats began abandoning their tunnels. Not for poison, not for cats, for heat. They fled upward, chittering in nervous huddles near the kitchens, fleeing what no one yet saw. Something beneath the queen's feet had stirred. Let's toss in a quirky historical tidbit. In 1268, an alchemist named Brennel of York claimed he could distill sleeping sunlight into a bottle. He never published the formula, but witnesses at his final experiment swore the earth beneath his workshop glowed for a week, and that one of his apprentices vanished into a shadow that flickered. Unrelated, probably, definitely, sort of. Queen Miravine no longer needed sleep in the normal sense. Instead, she entered sleep like one enters a ritual. She would lie on her fire-warmed bed, hands folded across her chest, and whisper to the shadows, "Show me." Then her body would soften, her breath would slow, her consciousness would sink not into oblivion, but into a place that remembered her. One court scribe, bold or foolish enough to watch through a crack in the chamber door, claimed he saw her glow, softly, steadily, like a lantern behind silk skin. He left his post early and took a vow of silence. The queen's dreams began to leave marks on others too. The cook dreamed of a feast laid out on a river of fire. The next morning, the kitchens produced a broth that steamed with cinnamon and sparked with invisible heat, reviving two guards who had collapsed from exhaustion. A noblewoman dreamt of wings, flaming wings carrying her over the sea. The following day, she was found on the castle roof, unharmed, barefoot, and with ash smeared across her shoulder blades. "Something's changing," Alaric muttered as he watched the sunrise shift again, just a few more degrees, a few more seconds early. He returned to the black box that once held the fire elixir. Beneath its velvet lining, a hidden compartment clicked open. Inside, a scroll written in heat-shimmered ink. He had never opened it before. Now he did. The text read, "When the fire dreams, the world must choose, wake or burn," and in the last line, barely visible, "She must not dream a name." He paled, because last night, in a voice that trembled the tapestries, the queen had whispered a name in her sleep, a name no one alive should have known, and in a forgotten grave far beneath the castle, a lock unclicked, the name she whispered was Valorin. Not a name found in the court's lineage scrolls, not one whispered in ancient bedtime tales or passed down in folk songs. And yet, when the queen said it in her sleep, her voice low and molten threading between the stone columns like smoke, every raven in the rookery shrieked once, and then fell silent. Alaric heard it. He had been listening through the gap beneath her chamber door, not spying, he told himself, researching, safeguarding, panicking quietly. The name echoed in his bones, and when he returned to his tower and thumbed through the oldest, dustiest pages of his collection, he found it, Valorin the Emberborn, scrawled in the margins of a forbidden codex, inked in a script so scorched the paper crackled at a touch. According to the half-legible myth, Valorin was not a man nor a god, but a concept that once took shape, something born of fire and desire, of dreaming itself catching fire until it stepped into the world, a flame that wished to be loved, and in being loved, devoured. Excellent, Alaric muttered. We're summoning poetry now. Meanwhile, in the Queen's chambers, the air shimmered with heat, though no fire burned. Queen Merivine had not spoken of the name. In fact, she did not appear to remember dreaming it, but she moved differently now. Her gestures flowed like molten metal, slow and intentional. Her presence filled a room before she did, and when she entered the Hall of Judgment that morning, even the granite pillars seemed to lean in slightly. There was a case, a peasant dispute about grain theft. Normally, she would listen, frown, pass judgment. Today, she paused midway through. "Have you too," she said slowly, "ever had the same dream?" The farmers blinked. "Pardon, your grace?" "The same dream," she repeated, rising from her throne. Two people sharing one fire. They shook their heads, and for a moment, just a flicker, the brazier behind her throne surged, bright, brief, enough to leave the impression of flames dancing behind her eyes. She dismissed them gently. "Go, and do not sleep beside anyone else tonight." That afternoon, it happened again. A steward carrying parchment collapsed in the corridor outside the royal library. Witnesses claimed steam poured from his mouth. He awoke minutes later, muttering phrases from a forgotten language, one that, when written down, matched the symbols from the Queen's dream scrolls. Later, by candlelight, Alaric tried to match them against old sigils of summoning. They didn't correspond exactly, but they spiraled, curled, repeated with intentional imperfection. Dreams mimicking language, and then something worse. They responded. When Alaric copied one of the glyphs onto a silver plate and left it overnight beside a brazier, the symbol had moved by morning, just slightly. But enough to prove one dreadful truth: the language wasn't merely written, it was alive, or becoming so. Let's fold in a real historical curiosity here. In 15th century Prague, a mystic named Etienne claimed he had taught the Hebrew alphabet to sing by heating letters carved from tin. He died of spontaneous combustion. The letters vanished, perhaps irrelevant, or not. Queen Merivine's dreams began to gain gravity, pulling others in. Her maid dreamed of a stairwell coiled with smoke that led to a voice repeating Valorin over and over in a whisper deeper than any cave. The court falconer dreamed his hawks burst into flame and returned reborn, with no eyes and too many wings. And a visiting bishop from Varlo, having heard rumours, stayed one night in the castle and dreamed of a girl made of embers offering him a crown too hot to wear. He left the next morning without his shoes. Mirivine, for her part, found it all delightful. "Are they afraid?" she asked Alaric, sipping molten red tea that smelled faintly of cinnamon and metal. "Yes," he said plainly. "They should be," she smiled. "Good." Alaric took a slow breath. "Your Majesty, you are not just changing, you are changing others. The line between your mind and the world is dissolving. And it's possible. You are no longer dreaming alone." At this, she looked almost pleased. "So I've found company." He didn't say the word he was thinking: possession. Historians still argue whether Queen Merivine was overtaken by a force, or whether she simply became something else, evolved in a way no science or faith had yet documented. Some saw her as a goddess, others as a cursed vessel. The truth, perhaps, smouldered in between. That night, she passed beneath the stars. She walked alone through the rose garden, now thick with blooms that hummed quietly when touched, and stared up at the moon, which looked wrong, bigger, closer, almost red. A shadow passed above her, not a bird, not a cloud, just a suggestion of shape, like smoke coiling into form and thinking better of it. She whispered a word, Valorin, and across the garden, one of the fire roses rose from the earth, not plucked, not cut, lifted. It hovered, trembled, then unfolded into a new shape, an animal maybe. A fox again, but this one had 3 tails and eyes like coal burns. It bowed its head and vanished. She did not speak of it, but when she returned to her chambers, her feet left no prints on the floor, not even soot. Later, Alaric found an old text buried beneath collapsed shelves, a fragment of a prophecy once dismissed as metaphor. When the queen dreams fire, beware the name unspoken. If it is spoken thrice, the world shall wake roar. So far, she had said Valorin twice. The final whisper would be the one that lit the match. The queen's garden had always been a place of solace. Tame hedgerows, obedient tulips, and polite fountains babbling the names of minor saints. But not any more, now it whispered. Not in words, exactly, more in rustles and cracklings, like distant parchment crumpling itself into prophecy. The leaves shimmered with an oily gleam, and the flowers, once pastel and sleepy, bloomed in shades not found in the royal palette. Black violets, red so deep they looked bruised, and most unsettling, the fire roses, dozens now, maybe more. They grew in perfect spirals, always warm to the touch, never burning unless asked. Miravine had taken to walking the garden every night, just before moonrise. Barefoot, robes dragging through ash-streaked grass that never turned to cinder. Wherever she stepped, the ground retained a soft glow, as if remembering her warmth. Servants watched from windows. None dared follow. Alaric, of course, did. He watched from behind hedges, scribbling furiously, noting the alignment of fire blooms, the lunar phase, the temperature of the stones after she passed. It wasn't science anymore, not exactly, but it wasn't sorcery either. It was something in between. Something newly born, he muttered to himself. If fire can be taught to dream, what else can be taught to awaken? Let's pause for a grounded historical truth. Gardens were sacred symbols in medieval courts. More than decor, they represented order over chaos, royal dominion over nature's wildness. A blooming, symmetrical garden was seen as proof of divine favor. So when Meravine's garden bloomed in unnatural geometries and began emitting heat, it wasn't just unsettling, it was blasphemous. And yet the queen glowed, her skin no longer sagged with age, her hair darkened at the roots. When she laughed, the garden bloomed brighter. It was during one of these midnight strolls that she paused beneath the southern arbor, a place once thick with roses and now crackling with restless sparks. She knelt. The soil responded by parting slightly. Just a whisper of movement. She did not flinch. Instead, she reached into the earth, and when she withdrew her hand, she held a seed. It glowed in her palm, pulsing red and orange like a tiny heart. She brought it to Alaric the next morning. "Plant it," she said, placing the seed in a small bowl lined with velvet and salt. He stared. This wasn't there yesterday. It was, she said, but it hadn't chosen to be seen. A fringe tidbit here. Alchemists of the Persian Golden Age spoke of the fire seed, a theoretical object said to be the root of all transformation. Some said it could turn thought into metal. Others believed it would bloom only once per age, if fed dreams instead of water. Most considered it allegory. Alaric did not. He built a shrine, not a religious one, mind you. He had long since abandoned the church's tidy cosmology, but a laboratory shrine, heat-controlled soil, a humidity dome, trace silver beneath the roots. The seed slept for now, but it pulsed when Meravine walked near. Meanwhile, the palace began, adapting. The queen had decreed that no flame would be extinguished after sunset. Fires were allowed to burn through the night. Candles were no longer snuffed before dawn. Tapestries were replaced with silks embroidered in flame motifs, and the portraits, all removed, replaced by black glass panels that shimmered slightly, as if waiting to reflect something that hadn't yet arrived. The court noticed. Whispers bloomed like mold in cool corners. "She doesn't blink anymore," murmured Lady Havrin. "She walks without casting a shadow," hissed a page boy. "She can hear you if you speak her name near heat," said one guard, then promptly refused to say her name again at all. But the queen had little time for paranoia. She was planning something. "Do you know what's missing?" she asked Alaric, seated by the open hearth that now needed no logs. He looked up from his scrolls. "A throne?" he guessed. She laughed. "An altar, for worship," he asked carefully. "For return," she said, "the fire remembers. It wants to be again." Alaric did not ask what it was. He had a sinking suspicion that she either no longer remembered or remembered too well. Historians still debate what. Exactly. Merivine believed she was doing. Some argue she saw herself as a vessel. Others think she was orchestrating a grand ritual of ascension, one last grasp at immortality through transformation. One radical theory insists she was attempting to give birth to a god, but all agree it started in the garden. The altar was completed 3 days later. It looked like black stone, but pulsed faintly. Alaric knew better. It was obsidian, mixed with powdered bone and a pinch of mercury. The shape was not cross nor pentagram. It was a spiral etched with firebloom glyphs and a single inscription. When dream becomes flame, return follows. Every night, Merivine knelt before it. Not praying, remembering. She whispered the fire's name once. Then again, Alaric, hidden nearby, leaned forward in panic. That would make it the third time. But she paused, smiled faintly, and instead of saying the name, she traced it in the air with a finger of glowing ember. The air sang, softly, a high ringing, like a crystal shivering at the edge of sound. The next morning, the roses in the garden had begun to hum. Not loudly, just enough to unsettle a hummingbird. And beneath the altar, something tapped. Not loudly, but rhythmically. Alaric no longer slept. He began preparing wards, a ring of salt around his tower. Bells dipped in oil hung from every corner, the kind of things that didn't work unless they absolutely did. He consulted old letters, revisited the formulas he had dismissed as impractical. He found one note, scribbled by a long-dead mentor, asterisk. If she dreams a shape into fire, it will not leave her. Beware the third bloom. It carries him. Alaric went pale. Back in the garden, the third bloom was nearly ready, larger than the others, blood black with a shimmer of gold. It leaned slightly toward the altar, as if eavesdropping. The queen didn't notice, or pretended not to. She was dreaming again. But this time, her eyes were open, and across the sky, a single shooting star fell in reverse. The fox returned. Only this time, it wasn't in a dream. It appeared at dusk, when the palace corridors glowed with that syrupy light just before the torches were lit. The court was half asleep, sliding into velvet banquets and whispered politics, when a maid screamed near the northern hallway. The guards rushed forward, armor clanking, spears at the ready, and froze. There, standing calmly atop the queen's own red velvet chaise, was a fox. Its fur was ash-white and flickering at the edges, as though flame crackled just beneath the skin. But more unnerving were its eyes, jet black, with vertical slits that blinked out of sync. Its tails, yes, plural, waved slowly, leaving trails of heat in the air. 3 tails, each tipped in glowing coal. The creature looked at the nearest guard and smiled, not with teeth exactly, not in the way mammals should smile, but in a slow, deliberate way that communicated an ancient, impolite truth. You are in my world now. The tapestries nearest the fox began to smoke. Not burn, just exhale long, black sighs. The marble floor beneath its paws cracked slightly, like pottery under pressure. Then it vanished. Not in a burst, not in a blink. It unraveled, tails first, then legs, then the head, which lingered just long enough to wink. Yes, wink, at the steward watching from behind a candelabrum. Queen Merivine was summoned, of course. Though summoned may be the wrong word, she appeared before anyone could go looking. She did not look surprised. You saw it? She asked the maid, who was still shaking behind a curtain. The girl nodded mutely. Good, the queen said. It's ready. That phrase, it's ready, would echo in the court for weeks. No one knew what she meant. No one dared ask. But the queen had started speaking in riddles that felt like instructions given to someone else. Alaric took a different approach. He didn't ask what it was. He asked why now. He returned to his tower, pulling out every dusty volume on spiritual familiars. Foxes, he discovered, had long represented liminality, the crossing point between worlds. In Japanese folklore, the kitsune could bend time and speak through flame. In Norse legends, a fox-shaped shadow led the god Frey into fire-laden dreams. And in a fringe account from a burned monastery, a monk swore he'd seen a fox with embers for breath that foretold the fall of kings. This thing, Alaric muttered, isn't just a dream. He remembered the rose garden's third bloom. He remembered the queen whispering a name, twice, and he remembered the scroll. She must not dream a name. So what happens when a dream becomes sentient enough to send its own messenger? Let's touch base with a grounded fact in the medieval world. Animal symbolism was powerful. Bestiaries weren't just books. They were spiritual manuals. Every creature had meaning. The lion was strength, the eagle vision, the fox trickery and transformation. But nowhere in those texts did a fox smile back. Miravine returned to the garden that night, as she always did, but now the fox waited for her. It sat at the base of the third fire bloom, tails curled neatly, glowing with that not-quite light. She approached it with no hesitation, as though greeting a friend whose name she couldn't remember, but whose scent was familiar. She knelt. It didn't move. "I dreamed you as a child," she said softly. "You danced through the frost. You melted the lake." The fox blinked slowly. "You told me to wake up." The fox's head tilted. "And now I have." They sat in silence. Just a queen and a flickering idea of a fox. Eventually she reached out. Her hand hovered just above its head. It leaned into the touch, and then vanished again. But this time, it didn't unravel. It stepped into her. Alaric, watching from a distance, felt the heat before he saw her stand. The ground beneath her glowed in a perfect circle. Her eyes, once merely fire-flecked, now smouldered red. Not glowing, not flickering, burning. And yet she smiled as if she'd just taken a particularly refreshing nap. From that moment on, the queen didn't just dream fire, she carried it, a fact the palace noticed very quickly. Scribes could no longer enter her audience chamber without feeling flushed and dizzy. Torches burned hotter near her presence. One court musician's lute string melted mid-performance. No spark, just heat. The queen apologized, but without much concern. "It's adjusting," she said vaguely. "The walls will learn to hold it soon." Alaric knew what it meant. He also knew the garden was no longer the origin point. That night, the fire roses began to grow along the outer parapets, then the stables, then the base of the western tower, all warm, all symmetrical, all blooming toward a central spiral, like fingers stretching for a heartbeat. The firefox was gone, but its shape lingered. The guards found burn marks in its exact silhouette appearing in random places, on a pillow, on the back of a mirror, once even inside a loaf of bread, baked extra crispy. "Thank you very much." It was like the memory of it was asserting itself in the real world, like a signature from a dream that refused to stay asleep. Historians still argue whether the fox was a separate being or simply a projection of the queen's evolving psyche. Some call it a guardian, others, a warning, and a few believe it was Valorin himself, testing her skin, checking the fit before entering fully. Whatever it was, it had become part of her. Alaric made one last entry that night in his black journal. "The fire does not spread randomly. It moves with affection. It grows where she gazes, blooms where she lingers. This is not destruction. It is longing." He paused, then added, "I fear we are no longer in a world of logic. We are in a love story, and the suitor is fire." The mirror cracked the first time the queen looked into it. Not shattered, just cracked. A fine line, spidering outward from the place where her gaze met her own. No one else was in the room when it happened. No heavy object fell. No tremor shook the palace stones. Just Queen Miravine standing before her gilded mirror, studying her reflection as if expecting it to blink. It almost did. The glass trembled faintly when she tilted her head. Her reflection followed, but half a beat too slow. She frowned. A tiny, almost imperceptible line formed between her brows. "Not yet," she whispered to herself. "We're not ready." Then she turned away. By morning, the mirror had darkened. The silver backing warped, as though something behind the glass had pressed too close during the night. One of her maids noticed and nearly fainted when she caught her own reflection staring back with unfamiliar eyes. The mirror was removed, stored, locked in the deepest vault, but it didn't help, because mirrors across the palace started misbehaving. In the steward's quarters, a shaving glass showed him blinking before he actually did. In the library, a looking lens cracked when aimed at the queen's chamber, and in the chapel, a polished bowl reflected a fire not present in the room, dancing red and gold behind the acolyte's head, vanishing when he turned around. Alaric tested a theory. He placed a hand mirror, just polished bronze, no silver, no enchantment in the garden. By morning, it had bloomed a rust-colored rose across its surface, etching the petals into metal like slow corrosion. He threw it into the moat. Even the moat steamed slightly afterward. Let's pause for a historical note. Mirrors in the Middle Ages weren't vanity tools. They were mystery. Many believed they could trap souls, reflect hidden truths, or serve as gateways to other realms. Some scholars even speculated dreams could leave imprints in mirrors. The Vatican outlawed soul mirrors in 1349. It didn't stop anyone. Mirravine requested a new mirror. Not from the artisans, from the dream. She told Alaric, "If my reflection lies, I want one that tells the truth." He refused to make it, so she dreamed one instead. The next night, a full-length obsidian slab appeared at the edge of her garden, perfectly smooth, cool to the touch, reflective not with light, but with memory. When she stood before it, it didn't show her present face. It showed all of them. The child who ran through ashes, the queen who sat upon a throne of velvet and suspicion, the woman whose eyes now held fire like a cathedral holds smoke. And then, for just a flicker, a fourth face, younger than now, but not the child, not the queen, someone unfamiliar, someone radiant. A face with no eyes, only flame. She stepped back. "Not yet," she said again, louder this time. The obsidian didn't crack, but it hummed. That same night, Lord Tellen approached Alaric in secret. "She speaks to her own reflection," Tellen whispered, "in languages we cannot hear." "I'm aware," Alaric said grimly. "She asks it questions, and it answers." The alchemist didn't respond, but that night he scoured the alchemical texts, not for potions but for thresholds. There had to be a moment, he reasoned, when the dream and the world finally overlapped, when the self ceased being one thing and became two, or none. He found it in an old diagram, half torn, likely copied from Arabic manuscripts, older than paper itself, a triangle within a circle. Inside, the phrase, "to see oneself as fire sees, unbound by time, unconvinced by form." Mirravine had passed that point, and the palace was starting to follow. Mirrors in unused rooms began fogging from within. A cat refused to enter the queen's dressing room after yowling at its own reflection for 3 hours. Visitors reported feeling seen by things that weren't looking, and in the queen's bedchamber, the air grew warmer, not just in temperature, warmer in presence. Like the walls were breathing, like the stone remembered her touch and longed for it again. That week, she stopped aging entirely. Her skin no longer bore lines. Her hair darkened to the shade of storm-charred oak. When she moved, heat shimmered faintly around her, like a desert mirage. Not beautiful, not youthful, timeless. A fringe tidbit for your dreams. In 1281, an Italian monk documented a phenomenon he called speculum ardens, the burning mirror. He believed that if one stared too long into their reflection by candlelight, the fire within the soul would reflect back and could leap forward. He died blind, probably unrelated. Back to Mirravine. The new mirror, the obsidian slab, had begun showing other things. Not always her face, sometimes landscapes. A lake made of light, a stairwell made of smoke. Once, a throne floating in embers. But one vision repeated, a hand, reaching outward, burning but unburned, calling. The queen did not tell anyone what it wanted, but she began spending longer before the mirror, hours sometimes, and she whispered things, not words, names, some no one recognized. But one, Alaric heard clearly. Valerin. A third time, he felt it like a punch in the chest. He rushed from the tower, slid down the winding stairs, burst into the garden. The obsidian mirror was gone. In its place, a circle of scorched grass, perfect, symmetrical, smouldering slightly, and in the center, hers, eyes closed, floating 2 inches above the earth, breathing smoke and smiling, not madly, not cruelly, with affection, as though reuniting with someone she had missed for lifetimes. Alaric fell to his knees, and the garden, once obedient, once sacred, lit 1,000 fire blooms, each one turning to face her, as if saying, "Welcome back." The palace walls were sweating. At first, It was dismissed as a strange consequence of the midsummer heat, condensation perhaps, or poor airflow in the older stone wings. But no one could explain why the droplets on the columns shimmered faintly red, or why, when touched, they were warm, or why they left faint burn marks on skin that lingered for days, as though touched by candlewicks rather than water. And then the whispers began. They didn't echo. That would have been comforting. These whispers slid along the inside of the ears, just beneath the hearing range, enough to tickle, to unsettle, to shape dreams without consent. Servants started sleeping in pairs, then in groups. Guards left posts unspoken for, inventing urgent errands that always ended with them pacing the garden walls, muttering, eyes glassy, and at the center of it all, Queen Merivine. She now held court only at twilight, when the sun dipped low enough that her presence didn't seem to bend it. She no longer sat on the throne. She stood, always barefoot, always in silks that rippled, even when no wind blew. Her skin, once the brittle parchment of age, now glowed faintly like honey poured over a coal bed. Her voice was unchanged, calm, cool, but when she spoke, torches flared. Not one counsellor dared interrupt her anymore. It was at one of these twilight courts that Lady Haverin noticed something impossible. The Queen cast no shadow, not even in full torchlight. The fire behind her danced normally, casting the shadows of banners and guards and stone columns. But Merivine herself, nothing, just a space where light refused to remember she had passed. Haverin quietly excused herself and never returned. Across the kingdom, rumours began to curl up like smoke from the edges of parchment, that Aravel's queen no longer slept, that she no longer aged, that she had no pulse. All false, of course. She slept, she breathed, she smiled, but truth was no match for the tone in which these rumours were spoken. People no longer speculated in taverns, they confessed. Back inside the palace, Alaric met with the council in secret. "She's becoming something else," he said, pacing between shelves of melting parchment in the record vault. "The line between her and the dreaming is gone. She's lucid," Lord Tellon argued, "sharp, brilliant, more decisive than she's been in decades. Because she is not alone in there anymore," Alaric snapped. "Her dreams are burning through into our world. The people are healthier," Tellon said carefully. "The city is prospering. Crops are flaming at the root," Alaric interrupted. "Ask your orcharders. The apples now steam when picked." Silence. And then from the back, the royal historian, Albrand, cleared his throat. "I believe we are witnessing an inversion of boundaries," he said quietly. "A queen who once dreamed of fire and is now being dreamed by it. It wasn't just poetic, it was accurate. Let's drop in a historical curiosity here. In a monastery in Uppsala, 1297, a monk named Brecht documented a nun who, during nightly trances, wrote letters in a language that burned through the parchment an hour after being read. She claimed not to be possessed, but invited. No trace of her or her writings survived, but the stone desk where she worked remained scorched for 2 centuries. Alaric had read that story, had once dismissed it as a parable. Not anymore. Merivine's presence now affected time, subtle at first, clocks ticking slightly off rhythm, sand falling unevenly through hourglasses, but then more boldly, dawn arriving too early one morning, then too late the next, shadows lengthening in reverse. A child born under her window named 2 days before it happened. The Queen was stretching the thread. One courtier, attempting to document these anomalies, found that his ink turned to ash on contact with parchment if he so much as wrote her name. Alaric called it what it was, chronodistortion by dreaming fire. No one liked that term, but everyone stopped saying Queen Merivine aloud. Even she seemed to sense the weight of it. At her next council, she addressed the lords with a new tone. Not regal, not maternal, but distant. "I am still your queen," she said, "but I am also becoming." They asked what she meant. She didn't answer. She simply stepped forward and gestured to a brazier. The flames inside turned violet, then blue, then white. In that white flame something formed. A crown, not of gold or iron, but of light, flickering and beautiful and unbearable to look at. She reached for it, halted, then turned back to her council. eyes smoldering. "Not yet," she said again, softly, as though reminding herself. Historians still debate what the white flame crown represented. Power, ascension, surrender, all agree that she never wore it, but all agree that it began to appear in dreams afterward, seen by farmers and noble women, thieves and priests, always just out of reach. Back in the depths of the palace, strange marks began appearing, carved into doors, etched into tile, symbols from her dream scrolls repeated like mantras, always in spirals, always smouldering at the edges, and then the humming returned. Not just from the garden this time, but the walls themselves, a low, vibrating tone that settled in the chest rather than the ears. It rose and fell like breath, as though the palace itself had lungs now, as though it was her. Alaric pressed his hand to a column near the throne room. It was warm, and beneath his fingers it pulsed, a heartbeat, and far beneath the palace, under stone never meant to be touched by light, the ancient vaults shook, dust falling from archways older than memory. Something in the dark turned once, then again, and above, the queen opened her eyes. "I can hear him," she whispered, and smiled. The palace did not burn. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. The air had thickened with heat. Tapestries curled at their edges. Ink dried in inkwells. But the fire, her fire, refused to consume. It moved, it breathed, it radiated, but never destroyed, unless asked. It was the 9th night since the queen had whispered Valorin for the 3rd time, and that night she sleepwalked, or perhaps not sleep exactly, not the kind most people understand. Her eyes were open, her body moved with purpose, slow and liquid as wax sliding down a taper. She wore nothing but a loose shift, and her feet made no sound against the stone. Yet everything knew she moved. The walls exhaled, the fires leaned toward her, and behind her a trail of faint ember footprints marked each step before cooling into soot. She did not speak. She did not blink. She descended the long hallway of kings, where portraits of her ancestors lined the walls. She passed them like a tide swallowing stone. The oldest portraits flaked apart as she passed, paint turning to cinders, wood frames collapsing with quiet sighs, but no smoke, no alarms, just release. She reached the great tapestry at the end, the one that had hung for 3 centuries, depicting the founding of Aravel, knights crossing a flaming river, led by a crowned figure holding a torch aloft. Queen Merivine paused, then touched the torch in the woven fabric. It flared. A flicker of gold-orange light rippled across the tapestry like heat across parchment. Then, silently, it began to burn, slow and downward, like a page of scripture folding in on itself. Behind it, a hidden door. No one knew it existed, not even Alaric, but she did, because she had seen it in dreams, because she had built it without waking hands. The passage led downward, deep into the heart of the keep, to a stairway long sealed. Stone steps twisted like the vines of her fire roses, and as she descended, the air cooled, not with cold, but with the opposite of heat, a kind of absence, as though the very idea of temperature had been erased. Here, no fire crackled, but it waited. She reached a gate of black iron, etched with symbols older than the kingdom. The metal pulsed faintly, not with heat, but with memory, and when she touched it, it parted without sound. Beyond the gate, the ancient vault, it was empty, except for a single pedestal, and upon it, a bowl, not metal, not clay, bone. At least that's what the historians believe. The scrolls never specify. Some say ivory, others something golder, something grown. But what matters is this. The bowl was already full, with flame, not roaring, not wild, just a small, steady flame, blue at its base, red at its crown, and humming with the same soft vibration that now lived in the walls above. Merivine approached. She did not kneel. She reached into the flame with both hands. It did not burn her. Instead, it climbed, up her arms, over her shoulders, around her head. And when she stepped back, she was crowned in fire, not the white crown from before, not the dream-forged version, but something quieter, something real. And she spoke aloud for the first time that night. He is awake, far above, in the palace kitchens, 3 iron pots shattered simultaneously. In the chapel, a stained glass window depicting Saint Aldrin blackened entirely, and in the garden, the 3rd fire bloom opened its mouth and exhaled heat. Alaric was awake. Of course. He had stopped sleeping after the 2nd mirror vanished. He stood on his tower balcony, notebook clutched tight as the air trembled. "She's walking through dreams now," he whispered, "and dragging the world behind her." He wasn't wrong. Let's insert a grounded historical moment here. In 1303, a scholar named Rutan of Thal claimed that those who dream in unbroken circles can walk between realities. He was ridiculed, dismissed, banished from the guild. But decades later, one of his apprentices was found comatose, surrounded by scrolls depicting spiral paths through cities that didn't exist. To this day, the meaning of his diagrams remains debated. Meravine returned from the vault just before dawn. No one saw her enter her chamber. But the fire in her hearth was already lit, though no wood had been placed, and her bed was still cold. She had not slept. She had carried sleep with her. That day, the court was summoned. All were required. Attendants, not optional. Nobles, scholars, soldiers, even the palace scribes. They gathered in the great hall, uncertain, anxious. The air shimmered faintly, like the hall itself was holding its breath. Then the queen appeared. She did not walk through the doors. She stepped from the fire. One instant, the brazier at the head of the hall burned alone. The next, she was there, emerging from the flame as though from a curtain of light, not as an illusion, as reality rearranged. She was barefoot, cloaked in ember gold silk, hair unbound, flowing like molten ink. Her eyes were no longer just hers. They burned with something older. "Today," she said, "I speak not only for myself." Silence. Even the guards held their breath. "I have seen the roots beneath our kingdom. I have touched the ember heart. I have remembered what was once forgotten." She looked toward the sky, though the ceiling blocked her view. "He dreams, and I dream with him." No one asked who. No one needed to. The name sat unspoken on every tongue. Valorin, and in the shadows cast by her flame, something moved. A shape, not human, not monstrous, just possible. And watching, Alaric hadn't run in years. It wasn't a habit one picked up after a lifetime steeped in bubbling mercury and knee-deep scrollwork. But when the queen vanished into the brazier and reappeared like a dream finding its own body, his legs remembered, and they moved. He didn't flee the palace. Not yet. Instead, he ran to the tower, his tower, the place where reality still mostly made sense, the place where fire meant heat, ink dried flat, and no one whispered from the shadows unless they were particularly bored. He slammed the door, bolted it, and pulled down every single book he hadn't dared open in 20 years. Root flame, dream lattice. "Conscious ignition," he muttered, as parchment flew. "Come on, old monsters, give me something." But the texts were quiet, and dustier than they should have been. He sat, chest heaving, then turned slowly toward the one book he never opened. It wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. The cover was charred beyond repair, its title unreadable, its pages scorched, edges fused like melted glass. Only the spine remained intact, bound with hair. Human, probably. The unpleasant kind. It had belonged to his predecessor, Maric the Pale, a man who disappeared when Alaric was still apprenticed. The story was simple, an experiment gone wrong, a contained fire, a mismeasured drop of powdered lime. But Alaric had always wondered why the flames burned inward. He opened the book. It did not welcome him, but it also didn't resist. On the first page, a single line, "When fire learns your name, it remembers you forever." He read on. The entries were feverish, incomplete. Diagrams of circuits made of dream paths, spirals enclosed in eyes, names that had to be written backward to prevent burning the page. One phrase repeated, "the fire that watches." Another, "the ember-born prince." And finally, Valorin comes not with armies, but with memory. He waits to be remembered into being. Alaric's blood ran cold, because the queen hadn't summoned something new. She had remembered something old. Let's add a historical footnote. In 1212, a pilgrimage of children set out from Aris to cross the sea by faith alone. The sea did not part. They were never heard from again, except one boy who returned 20 years later, silent, with fire-damaged skin and a single phrase carved into his forearm. He remembers. Scholars dismissed it as nonsense. Most still do, but some, particularly the ones with burned fingers, do not. Back in the court, no one dared speak. The queen still stood before them, framed by flickering flames. She wasn't levitating. Not quite, but her feet didn't seem committed to the floor anymore. My reign, she said calmly, is not ending. It is expanding. She turned her eyes on the nobles. They felt warm, not uncomfortable, intimate. You have lived within time. It has treated you well, but it has treated me as an enemy. Tellen stepped forward. Your Majesty, his voice cracked. With respect, the court, the realm, we must understand what. She tilted her head and smiled. The room brightened, just slightly. Tellen stopped speaking. His mouth continued to move, but no sound came out. His shadow, formerly long and curled, snapped upright, severed from his body by an invisible thread. It stood beside him, mimicking his silence. A twin without allegiance. Then, quietly, it bowed to the queen. She nodded once, and the shadow returned to his feet. Tellen fell to his knees, gasping. I do not wish to harm you, she said, but I will not be denied by the rules of lesser sleep. The guards didn't move. They couldn't. The floor beneath them pulsed with gentle warmth, like a parent's hand, firm but gentle. They were held by the building itself, and across the palace, one by one, the flames in every brazier turned white. Back in the tower, Alaric scribbled, We are inside the dream now. We have become its furniture. And in the corner of the room, his candle stretched upward without flickering, as though trying to listen better. Meanwhile, Queen Meravine stepped from the court and returned to her garden. Her roses greeted her, folding open in unison like worshippers at prayer. She knelt at the base of the third bloom, the spiral one, the one shaped like a flame in mid-exhale. It pulsed. I've spoken your name, she whispered. I've carried your flame. I am ready. The rose responded, not in words, but in sensation, heat, memory, and something deeper, agreement. A breeze that wasn't wind passed through the garden. Every flower swayed toward her, and then a voice. Not from the rose, from her. It poured from her mouth like smoke. Not hers alone, a deeper octave, reverberating with fire. We remember, and beneath the castle, far below, in the oldest foundation in stone that predated the throne, a groan rippled through the earth. Dust sifted from the vault ceiling, and the bowl of flame on the pedestal grew. It was no longer a bowl, it was a mouth, and it was opening. Historians still argue what happened next. Some say Meravine became a vessel, others, a prophet, a few, a god, but all agree, that night, the queen walked her dream, and the world followed. Beneath the throne, something whispered. Not a voice, exactly, not in the sense that syllables could be understood or transcribed, but the stone itself began to hum, low, insistent, like a memory trying to form words. It travelled through the marble tiles, through the throne's iron spine and into the air. The servants heard it first. Those who cleaned the hall of judgment noticed the floor grew warm under their bare feet, that the columns vibrated faintly when they passed near the queen's seat, that if one stood very, very still in the moonlight that slanted through the stained glass windows, you could hear, breathing, from below. The throne had stood unchanged for 500 years, forged from the bones of old kingdoms, decorated with ruby and black iron. It was a symbol of power, not of the person who sat on it, but of the land itself. The idea of Aravel, condensed into stone and steel. Now it pulsed, and one night it cracked, a single fissure running up the back leg, not from strain, not from age, from within. Alaric was the first to know, not because someone told him, but because his tower, a stone's throw from the throne room, felt it. He woke at midnight with the taste of ash on his tongue. The air had changed. The fire in his brazier wasn't dancing anymore. It stood stock still, upright and watchful. He hurried down the tower steps, robe flapping behind him like a cinder-streaked wing, through the halls, past the kitchens, into the throne room. The place was silent, too silent, not empty, soundless. Even his footsteps seemed to absorb themselves. No echo, no scuff, just silence. And there, beside the throne, stood the queen. She was barefoot again. Her shift clung to her skin, as if steam had pressed it there. Her hair floated slightly behind her, as though stirred by a breeze no one else could feel. She looked at the crack. Alaric followed her gaze. "It's begun," she said. He didn't ask what. He knew. Let's toss in a fringe historical tidbit. In certain apocryphal Roman texts, there are references to whispering stones, architectural features said to hold memories of empire. Some believed thrones could retain the will of past rulers, that if one sat upon such a seat for too long, the throne itself might begin to advise, or worse, override. Alaric stared at the fissure. It was never just a seat, was it? No, she said. It was a lid. He froze. A lid. Over what? She didn't answer, because the ground answered for her. The vibration deepened. Not a quake, no shaking, a thrum, like the low note of a massive harp strung beneath the bedrock. Something with weight, with will, and now it was stirring. Miravine turned slowly, eyes glowing faintly. They buried him beneath their empires, built their symbols over his breath. But symbols wear thin, and breath remembers. Alaric stepped forward, uncertain. "You mean Valorin? He never left," she said softly. "Only slept. I remembered him. And now he remembers me." The hall's torches all extinguished at once, not blown out. Withdrawn. The flame recoiled into the wood, as if afraid. Only the queen remained lit, her skin emitting a soft, pulsing light like a lantern held just behind silk. The crack in the throne widened. The iron arms glistened as if sweating, and in the silence they heard it again, that not-quite voice. A whisper beneath the whisper. "He is near." The next morning, the court tried to meet. They tried, but the table was warm to the touch. The inkwells had evaporated, and every sheet of parchment set down near the throne curled inward and burned from the center outward, forming the same spiral each time. They postponed the meeting. The whispers, however, did not. They reached the guards next. Stationed at the outer ramparts, several began reporting vivid dreams, not nightmares, visitations. Each described the same figure, a man made of fire, with a voice that echoed backward. They couldn't remember what he said, but they remembered the smell, like cinnamon, and iron, and rain on hot stone. One guard defected. Left in the night, muttering the name Valorin over and over. Another stayed. But his shadow detached the next morning. It moved independently for 5 minutes before collapsing like smoke. He was never quite the same afterward. And Alaric knew things were accelerating, spiraling. He consulted his mentor's journal again, the burned one. The final pages were mostly gone, but one phrase survived. When the dreaming begins to speak through stone, the vessel must either ascend or be broken, and then, scratched below it in a different hand, he chooses love. But love is not safe. Alaric felt the blood leave his face. The queen hadn't just remembered Valorin, she had loved him, or loved what he was. Maybe the part of herself he awakened. Love, after all, is permission, and permission was all dreams needed to burn their way in. Let's ground that with a historical fact. In the 15th century, an Italian alchemist named Esolino claimed that fire was not an element, but a mood, that it responded to longing more than fuel. His treatises were dismissed as poetic fantasy, until a locked room in his villa erupted in flames exactly 7 years after his death, ignited by a sealed love letter placed inside a stone urn. Back in Aravel, the throne continued to splinter. By week's end, its legs glowed faintly. No one sat in it anymore. No one could, and deep below it, the dream began to burn in earnest. A pulse, a rhythm, a heartbeat. The queen stood at her window one evening, watching the fire blooms flicker across her kingdom. They were spreading, gently, beautifully, like a painter sweeping red across a canvas. Not random, not ruin, reclamation. Behind her, Alaric entered, unannounced for once. "I need to know what's coming," he said. She turned. "I don't." That shook him. She saw the fear in his eyes, the exhaustion, the grief. "I'm not guiding it," she said gently. "I'm simply not resisting." And below them, in the old stone belly of the castle, the fire stirred again. Closer, hungrier, and for the first time in centuries, it knew its own name. The librarian never screamed. That's what unsettled them most. He simply stood from his desk, mid-sentence, mid-scroll, mid-history of something ancient and irrelevant, and began to glow, not blindingly, not suddenly, just glow, like a coal breathed on after hours in the ash. The other scribes barely noticed at first. It wasn't unusual for librarian Ferren to go days without food, buried under 1,000 footnotes. But this wasn't exhaustion. This was transfiguration. A quiet heat pulsed from his skin. His eyes turned glassy. One hand clutched a scroll, its edges curling. His mouth opened, and from it came not words, but smoke. He looked upward, and then burst into flame. Still no scream, just the sound of parchment catching fire and a final, gentle sigh. The fire didn't spread. The desk remained unburned. The books nearby only smelled faintly of smoke, but the librarian was gone. In his place, a circle of soot, perfectly drawn, and within it, untouched, a map. Not one they recognized, not a city, not a continent. A spiral of landmarks none had seen, etched into stretched vellum warm to the touch. At the center, a single word written in red ink, Valorin. The Queen summoned the map immediately. Alaric studied it for hours, sweating into his beard. "It's not geographical," he muttered. "It's architectural." "You mean a building?" asked Lady Haverin. "No," Alaric said. "A pattern, a dream structure, built from thought. This is where he sleeps." Marivine stood in the center of the war table, the map laid out beneath her bare feet. She turned slowly, tracing the spiral with her toes. "I've seen this," she said. "In dreams?" Alaric asked. She shook her head. "Beneath us." His breath caught. "There's something under the palace," she added. "Older than the stones, older than Aravel. This is not where we built our kingdom. This is where we remembered it into place. Let's pause on a real-world historical puzzle. Many medieval cities were built atop older ruins, sometimes layers and layers deep. But in the city of Derinkuyu, in Turkey, archaeologists discovered vast underground complexes no one could explain. Carved from volcanic rock, they went down 13 stories and had no recorded purpose. Some say they were bunkers, others, memory vaults. Still no consensus. Back in Aravel, the Queen gave a single command: excavate. It was not well received. "We are not digging beneath the throne," said Lord Tellon, pale and sweating. "We are," she replied, "but that could unmoor the foundations." She stepped toward him, and, the palace might collapse. "The palace is already unraveling," Alaric muttered behind his hand. So they dug, slowly, carefully, stone by stone, beneath the cracked base of the throne. And what they found wasn't nothing. At first, just a tunnel, a wide one, arched and lined with symbols that pulsed softly when touched. Further in, a room, perfectly round, black stone walls, ceiling shaped like a dome, but with no seam grown, not built. At the center, a pedestal, not empty. Upon it, a lantern, but not made of metal, of bone. Again, pale and porous, like bleached coral. It held no flame, but it was warm. Miravine descended alone. The chamber recognized her. The air shifted, gently. The walls brightened. A low, echoing sound began. Not music, but tone. The first note of a chord still forming. She approached the lantern. Alaric waited at the top of the tunnel, arms crossed tightly. "She's waking him," he whispered, "and we're helping." Lady Haverin said nothing, because as the Queen reached out and placed her hands upon the lantern, it lit, not with flame, with memory. Visions poured outward, not for everyone, just for her. But those near the entrance caught flickers. A man of fire dancing across a frozen lake. A young girl laughing beneath a sky of falling stars. A kingdom built of black glass and red silk, rising from embers. a mouth that spoke not in words but in longing. And behind it all, Valorin. She saw him clearly now, not a figure of flame, not a monster, a presence, a warmth, a voice that sounded like a song you'd known since birth, but could never remember the lyrics to. She wept. Not from pain, from recognition. Behind her, the flame in the lantern flared. It did not spread, it did not scorch, it invited. She turned. "Come," she whispered. No one moved. Then she laughed, softly, kindly. "Not you." She placed her hand to her chest. I meant him. The walls of the chamber pulsed. A new spiral appeared on the floor beneath her, drawn in shifting, glowing ash. Alaric stepped back. "She's opening the threshold." "No," said Havrin. "She is the threshold." Historians still argue over the nature of what followed. Some say this was the moment Queen Meravine was no longer fully human. Others insist she merely became what she had always been destined to be, a bridge between what was and what dreamed of being again. But in that chamber, one thing was certain. The fire no longer burned on her. It burned through her. And the palace, every hall, every garden, every crumbling mirror sighed in relief, because the thing beneath the throne was no longer a secret. It had a map, it had a lantern, and now it had a name. The mountains of Mercury had no true name, at least not anymore. They lay far to the north of Oravel, where no trade roads dared curl, and the air shimmered with unnatural stillness. Locals called them cursed. Older maps labelled them with sketches of weeping suns and upside-down towers. Most simply refused to speak of them. But Queen Meravine knew them. She had seen them, not from books or tales, in dreams. And now that the fire had marked the world around her, curving reality inward toward her pulse, she knew the time had come to leave the palace. "The map shows more than what's under our feet," she told Alaric. "It shows the locks." He stared at her, heart already sinking. "And these mountains, what? They hold a key." "No," she said. "They hold the tears." That should have made things clearer. It didn't. Still, she made preparations, not with fanfare or royal decree. She simply walked into the war chamber, now overgrown with vines of red silk and thornless flame roses, and announced, "I'll be gone 3 days." No carriage, no procession, just her, Alaric, 2 horses, and a box of unspoken ingredients sealed in fireproof cloth. They departed at dawn. The sun, clearly understanding its role in this new kingdom, rose with more colour than usual, molten orange, streaked with bruised plum, like it had been stirred by a divine spoon. No one waved them off. Even the guards simply stepped aside, bows lowered, unsure whether they were watching a departure or an ending. The ride north took 2 days, though it should have taken 5. Distances bend when fire walks ahead of you. Along the path, trees leaned subtly, birds circled once, then turned south, and once, just once, a fox made entirely of glowing coals padded across the path and paused to stare at Meravine before dissolving into ash on a sudden breeze. They arrived at the base of the range as evening fell. The peaks shimmered like liquid in moonlight, ridges reflecting silver like skin stretched over bone. No snow, no wildlife, just stillness, and silence thick enough to chew. Let's pause for a historical note. Many medieval cultures feared mercury not just for its toxicity, but for its divinity. It was the only metal that flowed, the only one that seemed alive. Some believed it to be the blood of fallen stars. The mountains of Mercury, if they existed, were said to weep it. Not through veins or springs, but breath. They entered the first cavern at dusk. Alaric lit a torch. Meravine didn't need one. The fire behind her eyes had deepened. She walked forward without fear, her breath clouding in strange patterns, spirals that spun the wrong way, drifting upward like incense. The cavern was wrong, not dark, glowing faintly, walls slick with a sheen like glass. The air pulsed with a slow rhythm, not the heartbeat from beneath the palace. No, this was older, wiser, a different dreaming. They walked until the walls opened into a cathedral-like hollow. At its center stood a pool, not of water, of silver, mercury. It didn't ripple when they approached. It simply watched. "It's not natural," Alaric whispered. "Of course not," Meravine said. its memory made liquid. She stepped forward. Her reflection in the mercury shimmered, then divided. Two queens stared back, one with her current face, serene and lit from within, and the other was a child, fire dancing at her feet, the very first dream. "They're both me," she said. Alaric said nothing. He was too focused on the sound. It had started as a hum barely audible. Now it was singing, soft, female, but wordless. It came from the pool, or beneath it. Miravine knelt beside the mercury. "It calls," she said. "To what?" Alaric asked. "To the parts of him that remain," she said. He was scattered, broken across memory. "This is one of the shards." And before he could stop her, she dipped her hand into the pool. The mercury didn't hiss, didn't burn, didn't swallow her. It welcomed her and rose, forming a column from the pool's center, coiling upward like a serpent made of molten thought. Inside it, a shape, a sphere, small, shimmering. Alaric staggered back. "That's the silver tear," she finished. "One of the keys. Not to a door, to a return." Miravine reached in, took it. Her hand came away dry. The pool settled. The singing ceased, and the cave sighed, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. Let's slip in a fringe tidbit. In 1420, a Breton midwife claimed she'd once delivered a child with eyes like silver who never blinked and spoke Latin at 3 days old. She said he wept only once, and where his tear fell, the grass never grew again. The tale was dismissed, but the field remains barren. Miravine placed the silver tear in the pouch. "One more," she said, already turning. Alaric followed. "What do they unlock?" he asked. "Not a door." She looked upward. "A birth." They left the mountains by moonlight. Behind them, the pool rippled once, and a flame, silver, not red, flickered at its edge, waiting for someone else. They found it in a nest of stone and bone, tucked beneath a collapsed altar that hadn't seen sky in centuries. The firebird's egg. It pulsed, faintly, like a heartbeat rendered in light. Not golden, not red, just colourless fire, if such a thing can exist. Heat without hue, a glow that didn't reflect off stone or skin, but seemed to be remembered into your vision rather than seen. They had followed the map, the strange spiral the librarian had left behind, etched in ash and fire, had led them from the mountains of Mercury, not back to Aravel, but east, toward the Badlands. A place the wind forgot. No vegetation, no shade, just ruin. Once, it had been a temple. Alaric could see the outlines beneath the crumbled facade. A place where geometry had once mattered, angles aligned with stars, arches designed to funnel sunlight like prophecy. Now, it was half swallowed by earth, torn open. Nature hadn't reclaimed it. Time had. They climbed the rubble in silence, the queen leading. She moved like she already knew the path. Of course she did. She had seen it in her sleep. "I don't think this is a place he built," Alaric said quietly. "No," she agreed. "This is a place where he was mourned." They stepped through a broken archway into a room without a roof. Light poured down through clouds, catching on fragments of frescoes, half-visible images of wings and fire, mouths open in silent awe or fear. And at the center the nest. It wasn't natural. Twisted columns of fused metal and root. Bones too long to be human. Feathers fossilized mid-flutter. It looked built, not by hands, but by memory, by reverence, or desperation. At its center the egg. Miravine stepped forward, her breath caught. This is where the last dream ended. What dream? The one that burned the first world. She knelt. Alaric stayed where he was. "Is it alive?" "I don't know," she whispered, "but it's becoming. Let's place a historical marker here. In the Coptic tradition, there is a lost manuscript, the Ashen Codex, that speaks of a bird of light that dies every 1,000 years and leaves behind a single egg that sings to the one who dares remember the flame. No record of its discovery exists, but fragments were reportedly smuggled into Vienna during the 17th century. They vanished soon after. The firebird's egg did not sing, but it thrummed. It felt like thunder behind your teeth. Like remembering the heat of a summer that happened when you were 5 years old. It was not loud. It was true. Miravine reached out. Alaric grabbed her arm, Stop. We don't know what it will do. She looked at him. I do. He flinched. You're not afraid, he said, of anything. I'm not alone anymore, she replied. And she touched the egg. It flared, not explosively, not violently, like a smile. And for a moment, Alaric saw everything, not just images, feelings, the scent of burning lilac, a sun that bled gold into oceans, a voice like a lullaby recited backward, and a presence vast and warm and aching, as if fire itself missed her. Then it passed. The egg dimmed. Miravine stood, holding it in both hands. It was warm. It pulsed gently against her palms, alive, or becoming alive, fed by her touch. Alaric stepped forward slowly. What is it truly? She looked down at it. The promise, and she began to hum, a soft, tuneless sound. The air responded. Above them, clouds parted, for a breath, and a column of fireless light poured down onto the egg. It drank it. Its glow deepened. Alaric's knees went weak. This is too much, he whispered. We aren't meant to hold gods? She asked gently. No, he said, to bring them back. She turned toward him, brow furrowed in sympathy, not disagreement. I'm not bringing him back. Pause. I'm allowing him to finish waking. She walked past him, and the nest, the temple, the stone, the silence, all began to crumble behind her. Not collapse, not decay, just release. The memory of the place had been fulfilled. They returned to the horses in silence. The egg nestled between layers of dreamcloth, fabric Alaric had only ever seen in theory, woven from spider silk steeped in fire salts and lunar resin, a material that insulated, not against heat, but against attention. Miravine held the reins without looking. I'm ready, she said. For what? He asked. For him. Let's pause on a fringe anecdote. A sailor in the 13th century claimed he found an island where birds were made of ash and fire. One offered him an egg that burned his hands without leaving a mark. He threw it into the sea. That sailor's descendants were later executed for heresy, after claiming the world ended once already and was now in its second dreaming. They reached the border of Araval by dawn, and the sky over the kingdom had changed. The stars were wrong, brighter, closer, singing, faintly. The dream was leaking upward now. The queen looked homeward, and the egg, sleeping in her arms, pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The queen returned with fire in her arms, not metaphorical, not poetic. Actual fire, cradled, pulsing, asleep. The firebird's egg did not flicker or spark. It simply was, a dense, contained flame that held the unsettling calm of a furnace that never dims. The palace recognized it instantly. Doors unlatched themselves. Silk curtains drifted inward toward her, like reaching hands. The scent of the garden deepened, smoke, cinnamon and roses that had never existed until she dreamed them. She entered the great hall at twilight. Every torch bowed low, and the people saw her, the same queen, same face, same crown, but different, lit. Her skin glowed like stained glass at sunset, not bright, subtle, internal, a warmth behind every motion, like her bones simmered gently beneath the surface. She did not speak right away. She moved silently to the cracked throne and stood before it. The fissure had grown, the iron glistened, damp with condensation that steamed before dripping. The throne no longer resembled authority, it resembled yielding. Alaric stood nearby, soot smudged across his fingers from scrollwork and worry. He watched her ascend the dais, not to sit, but to stand behind the throne. She placed the egg atop it, and the hall dimmed, the sky outside clouded, not with storm, but with shadow, the kind of shade cast by something large, flying very high, and not entirely present yet. Miravine spoke. Finally, fire, when asleep, is nothing. Her voice was calm, slow, measured, like a liturgy. But fire, when dreaming, becomes form. No one interrupted. The egg pulsed once. Then again, like it had found a rhythm to match. I was queen by accident. I am flame by memory. I was shaped by sleep, but now I shape the waking. A murmur rippled through the gathered nobles. Some tried to kneel, Others tried to leave. Neither succeeded. The palace would not permit it. Let's pause for a historical nugget in the 1100s. A scribe named Coldus wrote that a true monarch ruled not with laws but with presence. He claimed that certain kings changed the air itself, that the world adjusted to their will, not the other way around. He was promptly exiled for this blasphemy. His manuscript was found centuries later, singed around the edges, and still warm. Back in the hall, the egg began to crack. Not audibly, not violently. Hairline fractures spidered across its surface, glowing, alive. The crowd stepped back, instinct flaring. Miravine did not flinch. Alaric, white-knuckled, heart-thudding, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, it's not done. It's not hatching," she said softly. "It's remembering." And as they watched, the cracks shifted, not spreading, but aligning into spirals, runes, flame-born glyphs that pulsed across the shell. They told a story of something once whole, then scattered, then summoned back. By voice, by fire, by love. Alaric swayed. "You're feeding it," he said, barely above a whisper. "I am it," she replied. And for a single heartbeat, the egg was gone. In its place, nothing, no fire, no object, only silence. Then light. The shape returned, smaller, more focused, and now breathing. Yes, breathing. No beak, no feathers, not yet. Just a flame, cradled in the hollow of the iron throne, slowly reshaping itself from the inside out. A being waking in slow, sacred increments. A fringe detail, worth your sleepy consideration. Ancient Persian fire temples were built on the belief that certain flames were divine, never lit by man, never doused, some burned for centuries. The priests claimed they could speak to these flames, and that the flames listened. Some wrote of conversations, warnings, requests for rebirth. Alaric turned to Miravine, voice shaking. "You're not going to survive this." She looked at him gently. "I already have. I mean your body, your life, you." She smiled. "You assume I have not already become something else." She raised her hands slowly, palms open, face tilted skyward. The firebird pulsed behind her, its light rising. "I am not dying," she said. "I am continuing." The words echoed, not off stone, off possibility. The dream was spilling outward now. Windows shimmered, walls flickered. The flame in the egg stretched upward, testing limbs that weren't there yet. And all across the palace, the fire roses began to open in unison, petals flaring wide, as if to watch and witness. The queen stepped away from the throne. One pace, two, and her shadow stayed behind. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just respectfully. It remained at the foot of the throne, like a mourner, like a gift. And as Miravine turned, the egg cracked once more, this time with sound, a soft musical ping, and something peeked through. Not eyes, not wings, but light with intent. Alaric wept. He didn't know why, just that something beautiful had begun, and the world would not be the same after it finished. The Festival of Smoke was meant to be a celebration. Once every 10 years, Aravel held a great gathering to honor the founding of the kingdom. Bonfires lit across the hills. Lanterns floated down the river like drifting stars. Children wore paper crowns, and nobles got just drunk enough to pretend they were peasants for a night. This year, the timing was unfortunate. The queen returned from her pilgrimage on the eve of the festival, and though no official word was given, the people felt something had shifted. The sky above the palace glowed faintly. Even at noon, the moon looked larger. The stars refused to twinkle. The roses in the western gardens bloomed from stone now, not soil, and above it all, whispers carried on smoke. Still tradition prevailed. Booths were built, music tuned, banners dyed in saffron and ash fluttered from the turrets. The air was thick with roasted pears and sweet wine. Then dusk fell, and the fire refused to stay in its place. The first spark came from a lantern, innocent, delicate, swaying on a string over the central square. It drifted down instead of up, paused, then split into three. Each ember floated away, not toward the sky, but toward 3 different fires. It reached them. They answered, and the flames changed color, blue, then violet, then white. A priest gasped. A baker dropped his tray. And then the fires began to rise. Not burn, rise. From the pits, from the torches, from the hearths built for celebration. They uncoiled like serpents made of incense and memory, reaching upward in slow spiraling curls, not dangerous, not hot, just aware. Then they began to sing, not with notes, with resonance, a low, haunting tone that stirred tears in the eyes of listeners without them understanding why. The queen stood on her palace balcony, Alaric at her side, still reeling from the events of the egg, the memory of the crack of the light, of her shadow choosing to remain behind. Now this, it's not an attack, she said softly. Could have fooled me, Alaric muttered. They're not burning anything. She was right. The flames refused to consume. They danced across rooftops, caressed flags, leapt into the night sky like birds made of wind and dream. Then they rained down. Not fire, visions. People saw their dead, lost lovers, mothers, themselves, as children, faces that had only lived in memory, now flickering briefly in flame, mouthing words no ears could hear. A smith fell to his knees. A widow laughed and wept. A child followed a fiery bird until it vanished. Let's anchor this moment with a historical echo. In 1356, during the Feast of St. Valus, hundreds of villagers in Eldrith swore they saw visions in the smoke of their harvest fires. Each claimed a different image, but all heard the same whisper: the dream remembers. The church called it heresy. The town never held the feast again. Aravel, however, was past heresy now. This was transformation. The fire no longer burned in hearths. It burned inward, into the minds of the people. Their dreams that night would shimmer with spiral patterns, distant wings, and a word they didn't remember learning. Valorin, and above them, the queen watched with quiet grace. They see him now, she said. They see something, Alaric muttered. What happens when they begin to believe it? She turned toward him. Her eyes, always warm, were now barely containing something larger. They already do. He looked down again, saw fire spinning through alleyways like children playing tag, saw white flames circling statues older than recorded time, saw a beggar lift his head and smile, the first expression he'd shown in months. It's not destruction, Alaric said slowly. No, she said, it's recognition. And then something did catch fire. A single tower. The eastern spire, built in the days of her great-grandfather, a man known more for cruelty than wisdom, erupted into white fire without warning. The flames burned inward, not down. Inward, consuming something no one could see. The spire didn't collapse. It evaporated. In its place, a column of light, spinning, singing, and empty. No heat, no rubble. Just memory, freshly vacuumed. Miravine exhaled. He didn't like that place, she murmured. Alaric stared at her. He chooses now. He always did, she said. He simply had no hands to make it known. A long pause. Until me, below the festival of smoke continued. People did not scream. They watched. Quietly. Reverently. A city of humans standing beneath unfamiliar stars, illuminated by flame that burned without burning. The fire showed them not what was, but what had been forgotten. Their ancestors, their own voices as children. A better kingdom, one dreamed so long ago that even the stones had forgotten their names. And now it returned. The dream, the fire. Historians still argue if this was the moment Aravel ceased being a kingdom and became something else. Some say it was the end of politics, of history, of law. Others say it was the moment everything made sense again. But all agree, that night the sky did not darken, the stars sang. And no one ever forgot the fire that rained down and told them who they really were. Alaric dreamed of fire before he ever lit his first flame. He remembered this only now, half a lifetime later, as he knelt at the edge of the Queen's garden, staring into a brazier that no longer required fuel, and watching shadows shift in patterns that hadn't been invented yet. The memories came like heat through the floorboards, uninvited, unstoppable. He saw himself as a boy, 10, maybe 11, nose always buried in scrolls, fingers stained with soot. His first apprenticeship had not been in the royal court. It had been in a cluttered cellar beneath a candle-maker's shop in the city of Hallowrun. His master, Marwick, the Pale, Alaric had long buried the man in his mind, safely shelved between myth and embarrassment. A mad alchemist, half-blind, half-mad, and fully convinced that flame was a form of speech. That fire wasn't a tool but a listener, that it recorded us. Alaric had thought him absurd, until Marwick burned. No explosion, no smoke, just gone. A flash, a hiss, and nothing but a spiral of ash on the stones. The court called it miscalculation. Alaric called it foreshadowing. Now kneeling in this impossible garden, with roses that opened in the shape of ancient glyphs and soil that hummed faintly with breath, Alaric realized something painful. Marwick had been right. The dream hadn't started with Queen Merivine. It had started before, and some had known, or guessed, or accidentally brushed against it in their pursuit of alchemical truth. He stood slowly, joints stiff. Behind him the firebird's egg, still nested in the throne, pulsed like a gentle drumbeat. It hadn't hatched, not fully, but the cracks now formed a lattice, a language. Merivine sat beside it most nights, hands resting lightly on the armrests of her now vacated throne. She never looked tired anymore, never blinked more than once per minute, as if she were pacing herself, or being paced. "Do you remember Marwick?" he asked one evening, apropos of nothing. She smiled faintly. "I remember his hands. You never met him." "I did," she said, "in a dream. That stopped him cold." "You dreamed my master?" "No," she said softly. "He did, and then I did. Because that's how remembering works." He swallowed hard. "Alaric," she said gently, "you've always been part of this. You've just tried too hard not to be." Let's add a historical curiosity here. A French alchemist in 1317 named Clovis de Rial wrote a treatise on transference of prophetic memory. He theorized that dreams could pass like torches, one sleeper to another, especially when connected by fire or blood. No one believed him. His books were banned. But centuries later, one resurfaced, covered in soot and still warm. Alaric returned to his tower that night and began sorting through the ashes of his notes. Literally, the fire had kissed most of them, leaving only fragments. But in one charred bundle, he found something he didn't remember writing. A diagram, a spiral, labeled only Threshold. At its center, a name, Valerin, his handwriting, his ink, but not his memory. He stared at it for hours. Then, with hands he barely trusted, he began reconstructing it. Each loop, each sigil, the spiral wasn't just a shape, it was a path. A ritual, a remembering. He brought it to the Queen the next morning, laid it gently across her lap. "You gave this to me," he said. She nodded. "You carried it for us." And then, quietly, "Thank you." That night, he dreamed of Marwick again. But this time, the old man was whole, sitting on a bench in a field of smouldering grass, tossing stones into a pond that reflected stars that had never existed. "You finally figured it out, did you?" Marwick said, grinning. "You're dead," Alaric replied. "Hardly. I'm burned. There's a difference." "Why now?" "Because it's open," said Marwick, tossing another pebble. "She's opened it. The door, the breath, the fire. And now you'll have to choose. Choose what? To stay a man, or to become a memory." Alaric woke with ash on his pillow. Not dust, not soot, ash. And when he reached for it, it crumbled into symbols. Familiar ones, the kind the Queen had once scrawled in her sleep. He went to her without hesitation. "Is it happening?" he asked. She looked at him, her face illuminated by the egg, now casting moving light, shapes shifting along the floor, like a fire remembering the world it once ruled. "Yes," she said. "And it will need a guardian." He flinched. "Me? You," she said. "You remember in ways others don't. But I'm just—" "A vessel," she interrupted. "So was I." And as she stood, the fire responded. Not in the throne, in him, a warmth in his chest, a thrum behind his eyes, not possession, recognition. The dream had found another path, and it walked it gently, with embered steps. Time began to fray. Not unravel, just fray, softly, subtly, as if it too had grown sleepy under the Queen's reign, and was now nodding off at its desk. The palace clocks were the first to notice. Their ticking staggered, then looped, then paused entirely for long stretches, only to resume as if nothing had happened. One noble woman swore her tea cooled and reheated itself in the span of a single blink. A steward found himself arriving at a meeting 5 minutes before he'd left his chambers, and in the library a page turned itself backward. No one could deny it now. Time wasn't obeying anymore, it was listening. Alaric stood at the edge of the reflecting pool, now dry, the water long replaced by a low shimmer of heat, and symbols drifting across the marble like steam that had learned to draw. He dropped a stone into it. It floated, then sank, then returned to his hand, warm. He didn't flinch. He was getting used to this. The queen no longer walked through doors. She arrived, not like teleportation, more like memory. She was there because she had been there, and the world simply caught up. At council meetings, she spoke less. She didn't need to. Words now preceded her, floating into the room seconds before her mouth opened. Thoughts took shape in air. Scrolls rewrote themselves mid-sentence to reflect her will, often before she articulated it. "I dreamed we should divert the eastern road," she said one afternoon, running her fingers over a weather-warped map. "The road's already moved," a scribe said, pale-faced. "The farmers awoke to find it 3 spans east." She smiled. "You, see, it remembers faster now. Let's pause for a documented historical oddity. In the early 1400s, the inhabitants of a walled city in what is now Czechia claimed the sun rose twice in one day, once at dawn, then again at midnight. The second sunrise lasted 3 minutes and revealed shadows cast in spirals. A priest recorded it as a divine rehearsal. No one ever quite explained it. Back in Aravel, rehearsals were over. The palace moved as if it had breath. Windows blinked, glass shimmering briefly, tightening, loosening, as if focusing. Stairwells curved at impossible angles, especially for those attempting to flee. A maid swore she walked into a broom closet and emerged in the queen's private study, 1 floor up and 2 wings over. "I was holding a mop," she whispered. "Now it's a feather quill." The mop had indeed become a quill. It wrote poetry on ceilings. Alaric no longer questioned these things. He recorded them, observed the shifting patterns, logged timestamps that no longer lined up, tracked meals that served themselves before being cooked. But he knew something was changing faster now. The dream was shedding its disguise. The world, at least within the reach of Aravel, was becoming less a sequence of events and more a collection of meanings. The queen noticed it too. She began walking barefoot across the palace at odd hours, never speaking, only touching walls, doors, old stone columns. Wherever her fingers lingered, the surface changed. One iron gate became a curtain of woven flame. A pillar crumbled and grew back in spirals. One painting rearranged itself into a memory of a place none of the historians could identify, but everyone remembered. It was unsettling and beautiful and impossible. And then came the night of reversed stars. The sky over Aravel inverted itself, not like a mirror, more like a rehearsal for forgetting. Stars blinked in the wrong patterns. The moon paused, then rolled westward instead of east. Birds flew in soft spirals, then landed backward, feet first, wings folding last. People fell asleep and woke up halfway through conversations. A baker delivered tomorrow's bread today. The bell tower struck 17, then 2, then none. Queen Merivine stood in her chamber, arms outstretched, flame dancing around her without consuming. "It's accelerating," Alaric said, arriving with his cloak inside out, not by fashion but by fate. "Yes," she murmured, "the dreaming is impatient. It's breaking the pattern." She tilted her head. "No, it's returning to the first one." Then she looked directly at him, and time paused, not for the world, just for him. The heat stopped. His breath froze mid-throat. The air crystallized into silence. She stepped forward in a blur and placed her hand on his chest. "I need you to hold this," she whispered. In his chest, something bloomed, a spiral of warmth, slow, steady, ancient. "What is it?" he asked. "A seed," she said, "of the old rhythm, before clocks, before chronology, the pulse of what was. Let's insert a fringe theory from real-world alchemy. A few scrolls recovered from Moorish Spain reference chronodistillates, liquids that captured moments of time and could be injected into matter. Most historians dismiss this as metaphor, but a single entry from an alchemist named Saurid claimed to have walked through my own birth, lit by flame and exited older. Alaric stumbled back, breath returned, chest alight. "What do I do with it?" "Hold it," she said, "and wait." The palace walls shimmered. Outside, the stars spun once more, pausing for a breath, then continuing. Time resumed. But now it stretched. Minutes unraveled into ribbons. Hours folded like origami. Days whispered themselves out of sequence. And at the center of it all stood Queen Meravine, no longer moving through time, but pulling it behind her, like a flame leading a procession, a memory returning home. They built the pit of coals beneath the sky's third wrong moon. It was neither requested nor forbidden by the queen. The court simply understood, as one does in dreams, that something ceremonial was required. They called it the Trial of Heat. The name came from nowhere, from memory, from something older than names. Alaric heard it whispered in the rose garden one morning, carried on the breeze like a chant sung in reverse. The pit was vast, 20 feet across, ringed with obsidian stones now growing like teeth from the palace foundation. Courtiers, guards, servants, all gathered in silence, unsure if they were audience, participants, or kindling. At the center, coals, white, flickering with violet at the edges. No smoke, no scent, just invitation. Queen Meravine arrived barefoot. She wore no crown, no armor, only a robe of red silk, open at the shoulders, trailing behind her like spilled ink. Alaric stood by the edge of the pit, pulse racing. The fire inside him, her seed of the old rhythm, throbbed like a second heartbeat, syncing with something ancient. "She doesn't have to do this," he whispered. "She does," replied Lady Havrin, "but not for us. Let's anchor this with an old-world fact. Some medieval monarchs, particularly among the more ritualistic Merovingian and Etruscan branches, were believed to pass through fire, either symbolically or literally, to signify rebirth. Most were illusions. Some were not explained at all. One account tells of a queen who danced barefoot over burning thorns and was never seen aging again. Meravine stepped onto the stones. Not a wince, not a pause. She walked to the pit's edge and stopped. The air folded in on itself. Everything stilled. Then she stepped into the coals. The crowd did not gasp. They held their breath in one long, drawn-out silence, as if their lungs were waiting for a verdict. Each step left no imprint, no scorch, no hiss of skin. The flames bent around her, like shy children moving aside for a beloved mother. At the center of the pit, she paused and lowered herself to her knees, hair falling over her shoulders, skin bathed in unnatural light. She placed her palms on the coals. They bloomed beneath her fingers, spirals of white and gold, patterns not unlike the ones Alaric had seen carved into the firebird's egg, glyphs born of heat and memory. "She's not being tested," he whispered. "No," Havrin agreed. "She's remembering how to be born again." And then the singing began. Not hers, not the crowd's, the coals. They hummed, low and slow, in a language never heard but deeply known. The same tones that echoed from beneath the palace, from the throne, from the lantern in the vault. Valerian, Meravine's mouth opened. A breath, a word, a name, not aloud, into the fire. The coals responded. A pulse of flame rose, slow, fluid, as if thick with meaning. It wrapped around her shoulders like a cloak. From a distance it looked like she had wings. Not fiery, not spectral, just remembered. Alaric felt tears on his cheeks. Not from grief, not even awe, from clarity, because this wasn't a display of power, it was a confession. She was no longer what she had been. She had returned to something old, something beloved, something forgotten by flesh, but never by flame. The coals cooled in a breath. No smouldering, no smoke, just ash, soft and white, settling like snow. And in the center, Meravine, not burned, not crowned, just glowing, skin dusted in ash, eyes soft. She stood slowly and turned. The crowd, every one of them, fell to their knees, even those who didn't believe, even those who didn't know why. because belief was no longer a choice. It was a reminder. Let's offer one final historical curiosity. In a 9th century Persian chronicle, a woman named Mahara was said to walk across fire during eclipses singing to the earth. Her voice, the chronicle claimed, softened stone, silenced knives, and made men dream true. Some argue she never existed. Others claim she returned under many names. Meravine walked from the pit, not as queen, as flame, and when she passed Alaric he felt the warmth inside his chest surge. Not burn. Answer. She met his eyes, and for a moment he was not there. He was elsewhere, standing in a spiral city lit by 1,000 singing braziers. Above, a bird of fire circled the spires, trailing memory like a comet. Then he blinked, back in the garden. The crowd still kneeling, Meravine still aglow, and he understood. The trial had not tested her, it had welcomed her, and she, in turn, had welcomed it. Alaric had known sacrifice would come, he just hadn't realized it would ask for him. The morning after the trial of heat, the sky cracked open, not with lightning, not with rain, but with silence. A wide streak of unmoving cloud hovered above the palace, like a lid pressed gently onto a simmering pot. No birds flew, no bells rang. The world, it seemed, had stopped to listen. Queen Meravine summoned him without words. He woke to find the doorway of his tower already open, the staircase already alight with soft, smokeless flame, not threatening, just illuminating. She stood in the throne room, which now bore little resemblance to the place where policies had once been debated. The floor glowed in patterns, the walls shimmered with movement, like candlelight reflected off water, and the throne, well, the throne had stopped pretending it was just a chair. The firebird's egg now hovered above it, shedding gentle rays of translucent heat. Its shell was nearly gone, only slivers of its former self remained, drifting slowly around the being inside, a shape, undefined, wings, not yet wings, a body still deciding what it wanted to be, fire in the act of choosing form. Meravine turned. "It's ready," she said. Alaric nodded. He didn't ask what it meant anymore. Some words had already answered themselves. "I need to reverse the elixir," she said. That, however, caught him off guard. "You? What? To finish this? I need to give back what I was given." He blinked. "You're undoing the fire elixir?" "No," she said. "I'm offering it back." "Why?" "Because fire isn't meant to be kept," she said, "only shared or passed on. And then, softly, it needs a price." Let's pause for a moment of real-world myth. Many medieval alchemists believed that transformation, true, permanent transformation, could never be achieved without equivalent exchange. A term more often attributed to later traditions, yes, but its core was always present. Gain required surrender. To awaken oneself, another must sleep. Alaric felt the truth settle in his bones, and the price is me. She didn't confirm, she didn't need to. "You've carried the old rhythm," she said. "Kept it from breaking, dreamed when I couldn't. Held time steady when I stepped away." "I'm not ready," he whispered. She stepped forward and placed her hand gently on his cheek. "You were ready before I was." His throat tightened. "What happens to me?" "I don't know," she admitted. "You may vanish. You may burn. You may become." He laughed once. Shakily. Very comforting. She smiled. "It's a terrible kind of comfort." "Yes." He looked at the egg. The being inside shifted, leaned, almost as if listening. "You're sure this is the only way?" "No," she said. "But it's the one that answers the question." Fire asked. "And what was the question?" She whispered it. "Will someone remember me when I am no longer flame?" The answer had always been yes. Alaric stepped toward the egg. The heat wrapped around him immediately, not consuming, not painful. It was curious. He reached out, touched what remained of the shell. It cracked, not apart, but open. And from within, a voice, not with sound, but sensation, spoke inside his chest. "Do you choose to carry me?" He did not speak. He simply exhaled and nodded. The flame rushed inward. There was no scream, no light, no explosion, just the quiet folding of memory. When Meravine opened her eyes again, he was gone. No ashes, no mark, just warmth where he had stood, and a single feather, glowing faintly, resting on the stone. Let's offer a final fringe story. In a lost Welsh poem, there's mention of a man who drank the sun and vanished into song. The story ends not with his death, but with his voice becoming a road others could follow. No one knows who wrote it. The last line simply reads, "And so he became the flame that lit her way." Miravine took the feather, clasped it gently, and placed it beside the firebird, now fully hatched, wings unfurled, still without eyes, but seeing in every direction. It hovered, then landed on the throne, not to rule, to wait, to rest, she whispered. And the palace shuddered, softly, like a sigh, like relief. That final dream began not with sleep, but with stillness. Queen Miravine stood at the top of the palace tower, the one Alaric used to call home, though now its walls breathed softly and its steps curved inwards like petals folding around a flame. Below her, a revel shimmered in the late twilight, rooftops glowing faintly under the weight of a second, not yet born sun. The firebird nested calmly in the throne room, radiating the same gentle pulse as her own heartbeat, and in her hands, the feather, Alaric's feather. It glowed quietly, gold with hints of violet, the color of thought made manifest. She held it to her lips and whispered his name, once, just once. The wind carried it away, not lost, delivered. Then she closed her eyes and chose to dream, not the passive kind, no drifting off, no wandering mind. This dream was forged, crafted, called. She lay on the stone floor of the tower, arms folded across her chest, the way she had the night she drank the fire elixir. Only now, the roles were reversed. She was the vessel, and the dream was stepping into her. Below, the palace flickered. For the first time in days, the flame roses dimmed. The stars paused, and a deep hum, resonant, circular, ancient, began to roll through the stones. She dreamed herself standing in the palace garden, but not as it was, as it had always wanted to be. The flowers floated, their stems twined with breath. The air shimmered with stories unfolding in soft whispers. The sky above was made of memory, faces of people long dead, laughing in joy. The paths beneath her feet rearranged as she walked, not with chaos, but recognition. A voice waited ahead, not Alaric's, not Valorin's, something in between, something more. "You've come far," it said. She nodded. "I don't know how to return." The voice replied, "Because you're not meant to." She turned toward it and saw herself, not mirrored, multiplied, queen, child, flame, dream, all standing in a ring of light, hands outstretched. "You were not a ruler," said one. "You were not a vessel," said another. "You were a match," whispered the third. "And you lit the door," and the final self, the flame-eyed, fire-haired one, stepped forward. "You've carried the name, you've remembered the fire. Then, now choose." Let's pause for a scholarly debate in arcane folklore. The concept of the final dream is often misattributed to death, but among certain secret orders, particularly dreamwalkers and fire mystics, it refers to a liminal moment when a person becomes their own myth, not dies, transforms. Whether it's literal or symbolic, historians still argue, loudly. Back in the dream, Miravine took the feather, placed it in her own palm, and said the name a fourth time, not aloud but within, Valorin. The flame did not surge, it descended, gently, wrapped around her like water, like silk, like a promise unbroken after centuries. And then, the real world caught up. The sky above Aravel tore open in a spiral, not of destruction, but release. The stars spun inward, and fire, soft and full of breath, rained down in long curling ribbons. No one burned, but everyone woke. Every person in the kingdom opened their eyes with a sense that something had always been missing, and now was not. Not power, not peace, wholeness. A whisper carried on the wind, into every window, every ear. She dreamed the world awake. The palace shifted, not crumbled, not shook, just relaxed. Its walls no longer pulsed with need. The roses stilled, the mirrors darkened, and in the throne room, the firebird blinked twice and leapt into the air. It circled once, then twice, then soared into the spiral sky, gone, not vanished, fulfilled, and on the tower floor Queen Merivine lay still, not lifeless, just finished. A smile on her lips, a glow beneath her skin, and a final breath, exhaled like a prayer. Remember, the people did, always would, and for generations to come, children born near fire would wake with the name Valorin on their lips. Without knowing why, the fire did not fade. It settled. Araval, no longer quite a kingdom, exhaled into quiet, not ruin, repose. The streets still held shape, but the buildings no longer insisted on being seen. Trees grew where steps had once been. Walls allowed themselves to forget their boundaries. In the throne room, the light changed. Not brighter, not dimmer, truer. The throne itself, once a seat of iron and ambition, now cradled only echoes. Where the firebird had perched, a faint spiral of soot remained, undisturbed by wind or time. No one sat there again, not because they were forbidden, but because no one wanted to. Queen Merivine's body was never entombed. It was never moved. On the night of her final dream, the tower sealed itself, not with lock or stone, but with remembrance. Vines of silver red wove across the entry, humming softly, the kind of hum that only responds when called by a name not spoken in centuries. Alaric was gone, truly gone, but his presence lingered in the way the torches hesitated before lighting, in the sudden quiet that fell before a child asked a wise question, in the warmth that pulsed once when someone touched the center of the oldest spiral etched into the stone. No one questioned it. After all, he had chosen to become part of the dream. Let's reflect on a quiet fact. In 1474, a Catalonian mystic wrote that some fires do not go out, they simply become language. His peers mocked the idea, calling it romantic nonsense. But fragments of his writings appeared in 3 different countries simultaneously in the 1700s, written in different hands, but identical phrases. The scholars burned them, and yet they keep returning, much like the dream itself. Time in Aravel no longer ticked, it swayed. Some mornings came before midnight, some nights lasted minutes, others lifetimes. People stopped measuring, the clocks were melted down to make wind chimes. They rang only when it mattered. Children born after the dreaming came with memories too old for them. One girl recited the spiral poem before learning to walk. A boy whispered to birds that had no feathers. Another child, blind from birth, painted images of a tower that didn't exist, except to those who had stood on it and dreamed. The firebird never returned, because it never left. Not really. Its heat had been folded into stone and breath and bread and lullaby. When people dreamed now, they didn't escape the world, they entered it. Fully, there were still disputes, still hunger, still rainstorms that came too soon, or not at all. But Aravel no longer tried to be perfect. It tried to be remembered, because Queen Merivine had taught them the fire was never about power, it was about truth. The strength to wake the parts of the world too tired to try again, and the humility to leave when your dream was done. Let's close on a lesser-known belief in Eastern Carpathian lore. Fire isn't a tool, it's a storyteller. Each ember holds a name, each flame is a sentence. And when the fire dims, it's simply waiting for someone brave enough to listen again. Aravel still listens, the palace still hums, and far beneath the oldest root in the oldest tree near the outer wall, a single spiral glow faintly, drawn in ash and time, pulsing softly, waiting, just in case someone, someday, decides to dream forward once more. And now, slowly, gently, let the coals grow quiet. The last embers of the story flicker low, not out of fear, but completion. They've danced long enough for tonight, and even fire, must rest. Let your breath follow the rhythm of the spiral now. Inhale like the story beginning again, exhale like the final page turned. Let it loop slowly, not in circles, but in memories. You've traveled through fire without being burned. You've watched a queen unravel her name, a kingdom rewrites its meaning, and a dream step out of the shadows with quiet grace. Maybe you've even felt a warmth stir in your chest, something soft, something old. Maybe you recognized a bit of yourself in Alaric's doubt, or in Merivine's calm certainty. Maybe you're wondering what your own flame would say, if you asked it kindly enough. Or maybe you're just ready to sleep now. If you are, that's perfect. Because stories like this aren't meant to be held tight. They're meant to drift beside you like the last curl of smoke, gentle, fragrant, half forgotten in the morning. So breathe in, breathe out. Let the palace fade. Let the roses close. Let the firebird fold its wings for a little while longer. The dream has flown as far as it needs to go for one evening, and you, dear listener, have followed it bravely. So tonight, wherever you are, whether you sleep under stars or city lights, let your mind soften at the edges. You've done enough. Let the dreaming begin, sweet dreams.